As an RAF reconnaissance Spitfire patrols over the English Channel, its pilot suddenly spots something down below that makes him double-take. The impossible is happening. A massive formation of German warships is boldly charging up the channel in broad daylight, just miles from Britain's coastline. At the heart of the formation, her 9 11-inch guns bursting through the mist, is the beastly battleship Gneisenau, the maritime marauder, infamous for her savage hit-and-run attacks on Allied shipping across the Atlantic. As the Spitfire pilot radios through to base, his report is met with stunned silence. Gneisenau is supposed to be pinned down in Brest harbor, not escaping to continue her reign of terror. Panic erupts across southern England. Torpedo bombers are scrambled. Destroyers weigh anchor. Shore battery crews race to battle stations. The monster is slipping away, and she must be stopped at all costs. Laid down at the Deutsche Werk in Kiel on May 6, 1935, the battleship Gneisenau represented Adolf Hitler's bold challenge to British naval supremacy, a weapon designed to strike at the heart of Britain's maritime empire. Unlike the massive, slow dreadnoughts of World War I, Gneisenau and her sister ship Scharnhorst prioritized speed and range over raw firepower. German naval strategists had concluded that future wars would be won by severing enemy supply lines, not through climactic fleet battles. At 753 feet in length and displacing over 38,000 tons when fully loaded, Gneisenau was a formidable predator. Her designers had created a vessel capable of 31 knots, fast enough to catch any merchant vessel and swift enough to outrun most battleships that might pursue her. Thick Krupp armor protected her vital areas, with belt armor reaching over 12 inches and turret faces armored to 14 inches. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were built with a main armament consisting of 9 11-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. While larger than the 15-inch weapons carried by British battleships, these guns had been chosen for practical reasons. They were already in production and would allow the ships to be completed quickly. The turret mountings, however, have been cleverly designed to accommodate much larger 15-inch weapons when they became available, an upgrade planned for 1940 that would transform her into a true match for any enemy battleship. Meanwhile, Gneisenau's secondary armament bristled with 12 5.9-inch guns and an array of anti-aircraft weapons. 3 Arado float planes provided reconnaissance capability, extending her hunting range across thousands of miles of ocean. Every system aboard had been engineered for extended operations far from German ports. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst represented a new kind of naval warfare, commerce raiding on an unprecedented scale. These ships could operate alone or in pairs, striking at Britain's merchant fleet while avoiding decisive engagement with the Royal Navy's battle squadrons. Their high speed and long range made them perfect for hit-and-run tactics across the world's oceans. When Gneisenau slid down the ways on December 8, 1936, Nazi propaganda proclaimed her a symbol of German naval resurgence. Here was a vessel designed to challenge Britain's control of the seas through relentless pressure on her merchant marine. By May 1938, Gneisenau had completed her trials and entered service. With Europe edging ever closer to war, her opportunity to test herself in combat would soon arrive. When World War II finally erupted in September 1939, Gneisenau wasted little time in getting into the action. On November 23rd, operating alongside her sister ship Scharnhorst in the frigid waters between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, she encountered the converted merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi, a former passenger liner hastily armed with outdated 6-inch guns, operating as part of Britain's Northern Patrol. The engagement was a study in ruthless efficiency. Rawalpindi's captain, Edward Kennedy, knew his vessel was hopelessly outmatched. Yet rather than surrender, he chose to fight, reportedly saying, quote, "We'll fight them both. They'll sink us, and that'll be that. Goodbye." He was right. As Scharnhorst opened fire, followed 8 minutes later by Gneisenau's thunderous salvos, Rawalpindi was reduced to a blazing wreck within minutes and began slipping beneath the waves. The German battleships closed in and began taking prisoner the British sailors struggling for survival in the water. Yet before long, HMS Newcastle appeared on the horizon. While Newcastle was considerably smaller and less heavily armed than Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, she was a bona fide warship with proper armament, fire control systems, and a trained crew. Rather than risk damage in an engagement, the German vessels laid smokescreens and withdrew at high speed, leaving the rest of the British sailors to fend for their lives in the open ocean. While 37 men had been taken prisoner, and 11 were later picked up by HMS Chitral, the other 238 perished, including Captain Kennedy. Spring 1940 brought Gneisenau her first major battle test during Operation Weserübung, Hitler's invasion of Norway, as she and Scharnhorst made up the primary covering force for the amphibious landings at Trondheim and Narvik. On April 9th, at 4:30 a.m., a blip appeared on Gneisenau's SeaTac radar, indicating an unknown vessel just off the Lofoten Islands. 30 minutes later, the two German ships found themselves under fire from the World War I-era British battlecruiser HMS Renown, which had been providing cover for a mine-laying operation. Fighting in mountainous seas, both Gneisenau and Scharnhorst struggled desperately to serve their main guns effectively. The ship's low freeboard and bow design, flaws that had looked impressive in calm harbor trials, proved dangerously problematic in combat conditions. Water cascaded continuously over their forward sections, flooding compartments and disrupting gun crews who could barely maintain their footing as seawater sloshed across the gun decks. By contrast, Renown, though older and theoretically outgunned by the two German battleships, maintained a devastating rate of accurate fire that left German observers stunned. One German turret commander would later write in amazement, quote, "I found astonishing the high rate and continuity of the enemy's fire, which was not impaired by the heavy movements of his ship." Gneisenau managed to score 2 hits on her opponent, but even these successes revealed German inadequacy. Her first shell struck Renown but failed to explode, a humiliating malfunction that spoke to quality control problems in German ammunition. The second hit damaged Renown's upper deck and radio equipment, but failed to inflict serious harm. Renown's reply was far more effective. 2 15-inch shells crashed into Gneisenau almost simultaneously. The first punched through her director tower without exploding, but the passage of the massive shell severed vital fire control cables and took the lives of 1 officer and 5 enlisted men. The second shell smashed into her rear turret, completely disabling it and leaving Gneisenau with only her forward guns operational. Meanwhile, Scharnhorst was of little help due to technical issues with her own gunnery radar. Now at a disadvantage and worried that Renown's destroyer escorts might launch a torpedo attack, the German battleships opted to flee their engagement and escape to Trondheim. Even the German retreat went far from smoothly, with both battleships continuing to ship massive quantities of seawater over their bows during the high-speed escape, creating additional problems in their forward gun turrets. The engagement had lasted less than 2 hours and had exposed crucial weaknesses in the Kriegsmarine's capabilities. However, it wouldn't be long before Gneisenau was back in action. On June 4th, she set off for the Arctic Sea with Scharnhorst, the battlecruiser Admiral Hipper, and 4 destroyers to carry out Operation Juno, a desperate mission designed to assist German ground forces fighting to drive the Allies out of northern Norway and recapture the vital port of Narvik. German mountain troops under General Eduard Dietl had been pushed back into the mountains around Narvik by Allied counterattacks, and the Kriegsmarine was ordered to provide naval support to prevent a complete collapse of the German position. Having sunk several British ships during the first few days of the operation, Admiral Hipper and the destroyers sailed to Trondheim to refuel, leaving Gneisenau and Scharnhorst alone to hunt for more prey in the Norwegian Sea. On June 8th, the pair found themselves approximately 55,000 yards from what appeared to be a major prize, the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. Glorious was sailing in a dangerously low state of readiness under Captain Guy Doyley Hughes, who'd made a series of failed decisions. He requested permission to proceed independently at high speed, leaving the main convoy behind, allegedly not for tactical reasons, but because he was impatient to return to Britain to hold a court-martial against 2 of his officers. Only 12 of the carrier's 18 boilers were in use, limiting her ability to develop full speed quickly. Most critically, Doyley Hughes had failed to launch reconnaissance aircraft or maintain combat air patrols, reportedly to give his aircrew a rest after the evacuation operations. The Crow's Nest lookout position is said to have been unmanned, leaving observation duties to the much lower destroyer escorts. When the German battleships appeared on the horizon at 4:45 p.m., Glorious was caught completely unprepared. The carrier's destroyer escorts, HMS Acasta and HMS Ardent, hurriedly began attempting to conceal their charge by laying down a smokescreen, and the destroyer's warning allowed Glorious to finally sound action stations. But it was too late. The German ships were already moving in. In less than 45 minutes, they halved the distance between them and their prey and let rip a frenzy of gunfire. Glorious, her flight deck subject to a relentless assault, found it impossible to launch her aircraft. Her swordfish torpedo bombers remained trapped below deck as German shells crashed around the carrier's superstructure. Scharnhorst scored her first hit at extreme range after just 6 minutes of firing, and the carrier began listing heavily to starboard while still maintaining speed. The two British destroyers fought with desperate gallantry against impossible odds. Arden made 7 separate torpedo attacks, weaving through the German fire while laying smoke to protect Glorious. Despite taking severe damage that reduced her speed, she continued firing torpedoes until she was finally overwhelmed and sank at approximately 6:20 p.m. Acasta then continued the fight alone, charging boldly at the massive German warships. At 6:39 p.m., Acasta achieved the impossible. One of her torpedoes struck Scharnhorst amidships, tearing a 12-meter hole in her hull and flooding her with 2,500 tons of seawater. The hit disabled Scharnhorst's starboard engine room and put her rear turret out of action. However, moments later, Acasta herself was overwhelmed by German fire and began her final plunge. Her captain, Commander Charles Glassford, reportedly standing on the bridge smoking a cigarette as the ship went down. 1,519 British sailors and airmen lost their lives in the frigid Arctic waters, with only 40 survivors eventually rescued by the Norwegian merchant ship Borgund. The sinking of an aircraft carrier and 2 destroyers by surface gunfire would never be repeated during the war. By June 20th, Scharnhorst was able to start making a limping return to Germany, while Gneisenau and Admiral Hipper conducted a diversionary sortie for cover. Little did they know, the British submarine HMS Clyde was lurking beneath the waves, eager to avenge the sinking of Glorious and her destroyers. Her torpedo slammed into Gneisenau's bow with tremendous force, blowing large holes in the hull and flooding forward compartments. Gneisenau was forced to abandon her mission and retreat to Trondheim for emergency repairs, then back to German shipyards for extensive reconstruction work. Both German battleships would remain out of action for the rest of 1940, their crews watching helplessly as the Battle of Britain raged overhead. However, at the dawn of 1941, as part of Operation Berlin, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst would be given a new role. Under the command of Admiral Gunther Lutyens, they were now tasked with terrorizing the convoys, carrying much-needed supplies from North America to Britain in order to paralyze the British war effort. The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. On January 22nd, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sailed from Kiel, only to be spotted by HMS Naiad south of Iceland on January 28th. Admiral John Tovey, commander of the British Home Fleet, organized a massive response. The entire fleet sortied: battleships Nelson and Rodney, battlecruiser Repulse, 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers. German submarine commanders had positioned 8 U-boats south of Iceland to attack the British fleet, but only 1 submarine even sighted British warships, achieving nothing. Lutyens, uncertain whether more British forces awaited him, abandoned the attempt and retreated to Norwegian waters. After weathering fierce storms that damaged Gneisenau's superstructure, the battleships made their second attempt. The successful breakout on February 3rd and 4th came only after careful planning and favorable weather. Lutyens had refueled from the tanker Adria in the Arctic Ocean before attempting the passage, timing his movement to coincide with snowstorms that would hide his ships from British patrols. Once loosed in the Atlantic, they became phantoms, supported by a network of supply ships positioned across the ocean like a spider's web. On February 8th, the 2 German vessels encountered convoy HX-106 and prepared for attack, with Scharnhorst approaching from the south and Gneisenau from the northwest. But upon realizing that the convoy was protected by the battleship HMS Ramillies, Lutyens immediately ordered retreat. Captain Hoffmann aboard Scharnhorst, however, attempted to close within 12 miles of the convoy, hoping to lure Ramillies away so Gneisenau could attack the merchant vessels. This directly violated orders against engaging enemy battleships, and Lutyens angrily reprimanded Hoffmann by radio when the ships regrouped that evening. The British response was swift and overwhelming. Admiral Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, organized 3 powerful hunting groups, while Force H, including battlecruiser Renown and carrier Ark Royal, sailed from Gibraltar to protect North Atlantic convoys. Lutyens, aware through intercepted British radio traffic that his presence had been detected, decided to break off operations for 2 weeks, hoping that Admiral Hipper's concurrent raid would draw British forces elsewhere. However, 2 weeks later, they would get another chance when they encountered scattered ships from a recently dispersed convoy. Gneisenau sank 4 vessels, totaling 19,634 tons, while Scharnhorst claimed 1 other. The helpless merchantmen could only transmit desperate distress signals before German shells sent them to the bottom. On March 7th, the German ships encountered convoy SL-67, escorted by battleship HMS Malaya near the Cape Verde Islands. Rather than flee immediately, Lutyens adopted new tactics. He shadowed the convoy while directing nearby U-boats to the target. Acting as contact holder, Scharnhorst transmitted position reports every few hours until dusk. The coordinated attack proved devastatingly effective. U-105 and U-124 sank 5 merchantmen, totaling 28,488 tons that night, while the German battleships remained safely beyond Malaya's reach. The raiders' greatest success came on March 15th and 16th, when they encountered dispersed ships from westbound convoys southeast of Newfoundland. In a methodical display of destruction, Gneisenau sank 7 ships, while Scharnhorst claimed 6, with 3 tankers captured as prizes. The only resistance came from the freighter Chilean Reefer, whose single-deck gun blazed away defiantly until 73 11-inch shells finally silenced her. The final encounter nearly ended in disaster when HMS Rodney appeared while Gneisenau was rescuing survivors. The British battleship spotted Gneisenau in the twilight, but failed to identify her, learning only from rescued merchant sailors that evening that she had faced one of Germany's most wanted warships. Gneisenau had escaped destruction by mere minutes. On March 22nd, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst reached Brest in occupied France, marking the end of Operation Berlin. Between them, the pair had sunk or captured 22 ships, totaling 115,622 tons, an achievement hailed as a significant triumph in German propaganda. Brest should have been a sanctuary, but it became Gneisenau's prison. Within days of the German battleship's arrival, RAF Coastal Command aircraft spotted them through intensive reconnaissance flights. Winston Churchill himself declared the ships at Brest a priority target, and RAF Bomber Command began what would become the most sustained bombing campaign against enemy warships in the European theater. The first raid came on the night of March 30th, followed by increasingly bold attacks as British air crews gained confidence. German flak filled the skies above Brest harbor, but the RAF pressed home their assaults with determination. On April 6th, 1 week after the bombing began, Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell led a daring dawn attack against Gneisenau in his Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber. In an extremely risky move, he flew at masthead height through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop his torpedo at point-blank range. The torpedo struck Gneisenau's starboard side near her rear turret. The explosion tore a massive hole in her hull, flooding compartments and damaging propeller shafts. 3,000 tons of seawater poured into the ship as the crew fought desperately to control the damage. Campbell had crippled Gneisenau, but would pay the ultimate price when moments later his Beaufort crashed into the harbor with the loss of all hands. For his sacrifice, he posthumously received the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British system. Yet Campbell's act of bravery didn't mark the end of the attacks. 4 days later, RAF bombers scored 10 direct hits on Gneisenau with 500-pound armor-piercing bombs. The explosions claimed the lives of 72 crew members and wounded 90 more, devastating morale aboard the ship. 2 bombs that failed to explode were carefully defused, but the damage was severe enough to keep the German battleship in dry dock for several months. As 1941 drew to a close, Gneisenau remained under constant attack, her crew living in fear of the next air raid. As Hitler's frustration grew, early the following year, he ordered the 3 major warships docked at Brest, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, to make a daring escape to German ports by racing through the English Channel. The plan was so audacious that the Allies would never see it coming. The Royal Navy believed that the Germans would sooner sail the longer route around Britain's northern coast than attempt to run the narrow gauntlet that separated the island nation from the mainland. On the night of February 11th, 1942, Operation Cerberus would begin under the command of Vice Admiral Otto Silax on board Scharnhorst. Under the cover of darkness and German radar jamming, the three ships quietly slipped out of Brest harbor. For over 12 hours, they steamed undetected up the French coast, British reconnaissance failing to notice them. When British forces finally detected the German squadron approaching Dover at mid-morning, panic erupted across Whitehall. This was unthinkable. German warships were sailing defiantly through the English Channel in broad daylight. Caught off guard, the British response was somewhat chaotic. 6 antiquated swordfish torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, attacked through murderous fire. All aircraft shot down, with the loss of all 18 aircrew. Coastal guns at Dover fired 33 rounds at extreme range, all missing. Motor torpedo boats, destroyers, and hundreds of RAF aircraft threw themselves against the German vessels in piecemeal attacks that achieved nothing but their own destruction. The German ships seemed unstoppable, their passage a humiliation for British sea power. Even when both battleships struck magnetic mines laid by RAF Bomber Command in the approaches to German ports, they pressed on toward safety. Gneisenau detonated a single mine off Terschelling that temporarily disabled her engines, but the crew quickly restored power and continued the voyage. Even Scharnhorst, which hit 2 mines and suffered significant damage, still managed to limp into Wilhelmshaven under her own power. By February 13th, all 3 German warships had reached German ports. Tactically, the Channel Dash was a brilliant success. No German ship was lost. Strategically, it was a devastating admission of defeat. Hitler's surface fleet had abandoned the Atlantic battlefield and retreated to defensive positions. Gneisenau was now back at Deutsche Werk in Kiel, the same shipyard where she'd been laid down nearly 7 years earlier. Upon entering the floating dry dock, she was inspected for mine damage, but it was considered to be routine. Temporary flooding, a few minor mechanical problems, nothing the Deutsche Werk's skilled workers couldn't handle. Her ammunition magazines were restocked, and preparations began for deployment to Norwegian waters. However, the RAF had other plans. Having lost their primary target when the 3 Kriegsmarine ships left Brest, Bomber Command now turned its attention to the German ports. On the night of February 26th, 49 RAF bombers lifted off from English airfields, bound for Kiel. Hungry for revenge for 2 years of brutal attacks on Allied shipping, the British message was clear. Gneisenau could run, but she couldn't hide. At approximately 11:30 p.m., a single 500-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated the German battleship's forecastle and punched through her armored deck. The weapon detonated deep within the ship's forward section, and the explosion triggered a catastrophic secondary blast. Red-hot fragments ignited propellant charges in the forward magazine, creating an inferno that consumed the entire bow section. The explosion was tremendous. Gneisenau's forward turret, weighing over 1,000 tons, was blown completely off its mounting and hurled aside like scrap metal. The blast took the lives of 112 men instantly and wounded 21 others. Fire raged through the forward compartments, while emergency parties flooded the magazines to prevent an even more catastrophic detonation that could have destroyed the entire ship. Nevertheless, when dawn broke over Kiel Harbor the next day, Gneisenau was a burnt-out wreck. Her entire bow section had been gutted by fire. Her forward turret lay twisted beside the dry dock, and smoke still rose from her devastated hull. German naval authorities briefly considered rebuilding Gneisenau with her originally planned 15-inch guns, but the extensive damage would make this an enormous undertaking. On July 1st, 1942, she was formally decommissioned, while debates continued about her future. Any remaining hopes for her reconstruction ended after the Battle of the Barents Sea in December 1942, when Hitler, enraged by the failure of German surface forces against a British convoy escort, ordered all work on major warships to cease. Gneisenau was promptly stripped of her remaining armament, the once proud battleship becoming a source of spare parts for Germany's crumbling war effort. Her undamaged gun turrets were removed and installed as coastal batteries. Turret Anton's guns went to the Hook of Holland near Rotterdam. Turret Bruno was installed at Fjell, outside Bergen, Norway, and Turret Caesar was mounted at Ostrat Fort near Trondheim. In 1943, what remained of Gneisenau's hull was towed to Gottenhafen in occupied Poland, where she lay forgotten as Germany's situation grew desperate. As the Red Army advanced toward the Baltic in March 1945, German authorities made one final use of their former battleship. On March 27th, skeleton crews took the hulk to the harbor entrance and scuttled her as a block ship, a pathetic attempt to delay the inevitable Soviet capture of the port. Polish salvage crews raised the wreck in 1951 and scrapped her completely, with some reports suggesting her steel was recycled into Polish merchant vessels. Gneisenau's legacy stands as a monument to strategic miscalculation. Despite her impressive design and early tactical successes, she represented a fundamentally flawed approach to naval warfare. Germany's surface raiders could terrorize merchant shipping, but they could never decisively challenge Allied naval supremacy. In the end, Hitler's magnificent battleships proved to be expensive distractions from the submarine warfare that might have actually severed Britain's lifelines.